Hello and greetings from Australia. Now, I fear my presence on this panel might be slightly under false pretenses. My lab has no physical presence, no paid staff, no institutional home, no ongoing funding. What it does have is about 40 GitHub repositories, more than 100 Jupyter notebooks that enable you to run live code in the cloud, a wide variety of tools, examples, tutorials, hacks, and even a few pre-harvested datasets. The GLAM Workbench aims to help researchers make use of the digital collections of galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. It's mostly focused at the moment on Australia and New Zealand, but the Web Archive section that I'm going to be focusing on today covers, of course, a much wider geographical range. So, let's focus in on the Web Archive section of the GLAM Workbench. The development of the Web Archive section was funded by the IIPC under their discretionary funding program, and I developed it in cooperation with the UK Web Archive, the National Library of Australia, and the National Library of New Zealand. And I was very pleased that the Web Archive section won the British Library Labs Research Award at the end of last year. The aims of the project were, in particular, to provide a starting point for researchers who wanted to make use of web archives but weren't really sure how to do it. So the idea was to really provide a low barrier for entry where people could go in, experiment, and start asking historical questions of web archives without having to install any special software or use any special tools. The repositories used within the Web Archives section are, of course, the repositories of the partners that I worked with in developing the notebooks, the Australian Web Archive, the New Zealand Web Archive, and the UK Web Archive. But I threw in the Wayback Machine and the Internet Archive as well. Now, the notebooks are focused on these repositories, and they all have a little line which says which repositories they work with. But because web archives tend to use the same sets of software and support things like the Memento protocol, it means that most of the notebooks can be fairly easily adapted to work with other web archives systems. In the Web Archive section, there are 16 notebooks and apps, and they cover three main themes: types of data, which looks at basically just the sort of data that you get out of web archives. How you can harvest data to create your own data sets, and exploring in particular how you can use web archives to analyze and visualize change over time. So an example of the section on types of data is one which just explains how time maps and mementos work by throwing out a whole lot of working examples. So you can actually see what happens when you query the different web archives and the responses you get back. It also documents some slight variations in the way these protocols are implemented across the different platforms. Harvesting data. So with this notebook, you can feed it a URL or a set of URLs, or a wildcard query that works with a CDX API of a web archive, and it will go and harvest all the mementos from those URLs and then extract the text from those pages. Once you've done that, once you've assembled your database with all this text in it, of course, then you can feed it to your favorite text analysis platform to look at how the language varies, for example, or when particular events occur within those notebooks, exploring all that sort of thing over time. Another example of how you can look at change over time is this notebook, which runs as an app basically, and you just give it a URL and it'll look at all the captures of that URL and show you what changes between each capture. So what text gets deleted, added, or changed. Another way of exploring change over time is to look at the design of web pages. So there are a couple of notebooks there which help you to capture full page screenshots and arrange them in a time series if you like. What I've tried to do with the GLAM Workbench is really provide a series of different pathways, recognizing that researchers are going to approach it with different knowledge, with different levels of skill, with different technical abilities. So some of the notebooks basically just run as web apps. You don't see any code, you just get some widgets, you put things in the boxes, press the button, and hey presto, you get some useful data back. Other notebooks take you on a much deeper dive, looking at the code you might use to query web archives, how you can put together different workflows to process different types of data. Another way which I've tried to develop these different pathways for researchers is to make it easy for them to get started with a single click. So if you within the GLAM Workbench, you'll see these links which say run live on Binder. You just click on that link, it spins up the Binder service, which creates an environment, a computing environment with all the software that you need, and loads up the notebook ready to run. So it's about creating that sort of low barrier of entry which enable a researcher who might be curious about using web archives to get started, to start experimenting without having to worry about the software that they might need or how they configure anything. Click on the link, get started, start exploring. But there's a problem with that, and that is that Binder has limits, and if you're harvesting a lot of data, you're going to strike some of those limits. So I've spent a lot of time recently developing the next step beyond Binder. And I'm pleased to say now that I've got integration with Reclaim Cloud. Reclaim Cloud is a paid hosting service, but it's very much focused on the needs of digital humanities researchers. So I've set up the Web Archives repository now that there's a button. You click on the button, it installs the repository, creates your environment, everything that you need within Reclaim Cloud. That environment is similar to the one on Binder, but it's persistent. It will stay there until you switch it off. So all your data will be saved. And it's using a Docker image, which you can just run on your own computer if you'd prefer as well. So now, instead of one lab, there's a lab for everybody. You create your own lab where you can store your data, do your experiments, all based on the repository from the GLAM Workbench. And you can even get a t-shirt if you want. Here's the gov.au subdomains. In terms of outreach, I've been giving a lot of talks and workshops, and they're all available through the GLAM Workbench. Of course, there's also a new news feed. Exploring use, so these are some stats that I just generated. Looking at the number of times GLAM Workbench repositories were launched using the Binder service over the last year. And you can see the Web Archives repository is getting quite a lot of use, which is fabulous. Okay, so that's me. Please tweet at me at RAG. Please use the GLAM Workbench hashtag and explore what's possible through the Web Archive section of the GLAM Workbench. Thanks very much.